It was absolutely astounding. If I had seen it on a cinematograph film, I should have thought it was fake. That was Captain Sir Edward Halsey. My name's Kevin, and this is History Goon. What's going on, everybody? We are back. This one is a bonus. We're going to call it a Christmas present to all of you guys for being excellent and being incredibly supportive with my stuff that I do here. And to say thank you, I wanted to tell you a really sad Christmas story. Because that's what seems like that's what I'm doing this season. Is just like, hey, this is a bummer. And we're going to just continue to make it a bummer. Except Sam Whittemore. He was fun because he was just out of his mind. I have a dog now, and he's making me crazy because he doesn't listen. So I have to keep chasing this dog around because I've not become big enough. I don't have a big enough audience to be able to zap my dog on camera and have people not care about it, like that one guy. Seems like a nice dude, right? So anyway. So this is one of those stories that I'm sure we've all heard before, considering it's one of the most well-known moments of the First World War. It's both happy and heartbreaking at the same time. Little did these young men know that they were about to take part in one of the best-known events of World War I. The saddest part is there are so few first-hand accounts from it. Obviously, at this point in time, there's no survivors left to interview, but there wasn't a lot of guys that took part in this that actually survived long enough to tell the story later on as they got older. All we have now are some of the more short stories that were passed back by the men that experienced it. We've talked about World War I here before, obviously. In my mind, probably the biggest waste of an entire generation in the last couple hundred years. Young men from every walk of life and every social class from many different countries brought together to kill each other over what basically works out to be a family dispute. The days leading up to Christmas Day 1914, the skies have cleared. This time of year in the coastal parts of France and Belgium is notorious for driving, pouring rain. With the skies clearing but still being December, it got incredibly cold, which froze the mud of the trenches in no man's land, which actually made life a little bit better. Because anybody that lives in a cold climate like me knows that if you go outside in the winter and it's overcast, it's usually not terrible. If you go outside and look up and the stars are out, it's probably a little bit colder than you want it to be while you're out there. The mud that would normally suck your boots off dried up and made moving a lot easier. This also happened right after a British troop rotation, which made the guys that were headed to the rear for rest pretty happy, while the guys that are now in the trenches are miserable because they're freezing. Can't really blame them. You went from soaking wet to freezing cold, while the guys that you replaced are now getting hot meals, uniforms, and hot showers. I did find a really good first-hand account of this, and honestly, instead of trying to tell you what he said, I'm going to read directly from the man himself. His name was Bruce Banesfather. It's a great name. That sounds like Bruce Banesfather. That sounds like a Batman villain, like his dad came back and was like, I'm going to teach the spoiled little lesson and going to become, I don't know, some kind of a disease-based super villain, because that seems to be what kills bats, unfortunately. This is from his account called Bullets and Billets. This chapter is titled Christmas Eve, A Lull in the Hate, which that speaks for itself as to what these guys were going through. Quote, shortly after the doings set forth in the previous chapter, we left the trenches for our usual days in billets. It was now nearing Christmas Day, and we knew it would fall to our lot to be back in the trenches again on the 23rd of December, and that we would, in consequence, spend our Christmas there. That's got to be so hard to think about, especially as a young man where, again, most of these guys, by today's standards, couldn't buy a beer in the United States at the age they were at fighting. I remember the time being very down on my luck about this, as anything in the nature of Christmas Day festivities was obviously knocked on the head. Now, however, looking back at it all, I wouldn't have missed that unique, weird Christmas Day for anything. We went in again on the 23rd. The weather had now become very fine and cold. The dawn of the 24th brought a perfectly still, cold, frosty day. The spirit of Christmas began to permeate us all. We tried to plot ways and means of making the next day, Christmas, different in some way to the others. Invitations from one dugout to another for sundry meals were beginning to circulate. Christmas Eve was, in the way of weather, everything that Christmas Eve should be. I was billed to appear at a dugout about a quarter of a mile to the left that evening to have rather a special thing in trench dinners. Not quite so much bully and macanucci. The f is that? I was hoping it wouldn't come to this, but I think we're gonna ADD break in this episode here, because I have no clue what that means. So bully and macanucci is basically, from what I'm seeing on these recipe websites, where thankfully I found one where I didn't have to get a 4-page dissertation about, how this person's grandmother had to walk 37 miles uphill both ways with no shoes on to collect the onions for this. It's just beef stew, seems like. But if there's one thing that pisses me off as someone who likes to cook, is when I want to try something new and I have to find a recipe for it on the internet. When I have to listen to somebody, not even listen to, when I have to read about somebody whose great grandfather had like a terrible case of hemorrhoids, and the only thing that would cure it was by cooking like this particular set of vegetables with just enough salt, not too much pepper, and just enough garlic powder, or else his hemorrhoids got worse. I don't care. Give me the ingredients, tell me how long to cook things, and we're good. I don't even care about the prep time. I'll figure that out as I'm doing it. I just, with a fiery passion, hate having to get a backstory when I just want to figure out a different way to cook chicken and rice. Okay, anyway, a bottle of wine and a medley of tinned things from home deputized in their absence. Man, thinking about getting like canned meat and you're like, oh my God, this is a treat. That's, boy, man, war sucks. And it never got better. It still sucks. I mean, the food now is probably a little bit better. I've eaten MREs. They're not terrible. But, I mean, if I could like have my own homemade shepherd's pie or eat chili mac out of a bag with some kind of weird like nuclear chemical in it and that you put in the water to heat it up. You know, I don't like oil that much. I'd rather just cook my own food. The day had been entirely free from shelling, and somehow we felt that the Booches too wanted to be quiet. The Booches were like a nickname for the Germans. There was a kind of an invisible, intangible feeling extending across the frozen swamp between the two lines, which said, quote, "This is Christmas Eve for both of us. We have something in common." I'm going to have a hard time getting through this episode without crying. About 10 p.m., I made my exit from the convenient dugout on the left of the line and walked back to my own lair. On arriving at my own bit of trench, I found several of the men standing out and all very cheerful. There was a good bit of singing and talking going on, jokes and jibes on our curious Christmas Eve, as contrasted with any former one, were thick in the air. One of my men turned to me and said, quote, "You can hear 'em quite plain, sir." "Hear what?" I inquired. "The Germans over there, sir. Hear 'em singing and playing on a band or something." I listened away across the field, among the dark shadows beyond. I could hear the murmur of voices, and an occasional burst of some unintelligible song would come floating out of the frosty air. The singing seemed to be loudest and most distant, a bit to our right. I popped into my dugout and found the platoon commander. Quote, "Do you hear the Booches kicking up a racket over there?" I said. "Yes," he replied. "They've been at it some time." Come on, I said. Let's go along the trench to the hedge there on the right. That's the nearest point to them over there. So we stumbled along our now hard frosted ditch and scrambled up on the bank above, strode across the field on our next bit of trench on the right. Everyone was listening. An improvised Bush band was playing a precarious version of Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, at the conclusion of which some of our... This is a term. This was a term, and I... You could probably use this term interchangeably with a completely different group of people. Some of our mouth organ experts retaliated with snatches of ragtime songs and imitations of the German tune. Suddenly, we heard a confused shouting from the other side. We all stopped to listen. The shout came again. A voice in the darkness shouted in English with a strong German accent. "Come over here." A ripple of mirth swept along our trenches, followed by a rude outburst of mouth organs and laughter. Man, I am not grown up enough to not laugh every time I have to say the word mouth organ. Presently in a lull, one of our sergeants repeated the request, "Come over here." The German responded, "You come halfway, I come halfway," from the darkness. "Come on then," shouted the sergeant. "I'm coming along the hedge." "Ah, but there are two of you," came back the voice from the other side. Well, anyway, after much suspicious shouting and jocular derision from both sides, our sergeant walked along the hedge, which ran at right angles to the two lines of trenches. He was quickly out of sight, but as we all listened in breathless silence, we soon heard a spasmodic conversation taking place out there in the darkness. Presently, the sergeant returned. He had with him a few German cigars and cigarettes, which he exchanged for a couple of Macanucci's and a tin of Capstan. Is that like a tea or a liquor or something? Let's find out together as a couple. Okay, so after a micro ADD break, Capstan was a type of chewing tobacco. The seance was over, but it had given just the requisite touch of our Christmas Eve, something a little human and out of the ordinary routine. After months of vindictive sniping and shelling, this little episode came as an invigorating tonic and a welcome relief to the daily of antagonism. It did not lessen our determination, but just put a little human punctuation mark in our lives of cold and humid hate. Just on the right day, too, Christmas Eve. But as a curious episode, this was nothing in comparison to our experience on the following day. On Christmas morning, I woke very early and emerged from my dugout into the trench. It was a perfect day, a beautiful cloudless blue sky, the ground hard and white, fading off towards the woods in a thin, low-lying mist. It was such a day as invariably depicted by artists on Christmas cards, the ideal Christmas day of fiction. Oh, man, there is a song that goes along with this that I unfortunately cannot play in the episode, because if I do, Spotify will send someone out here to shoot me in the legs. It is required listening, either at some point during this episode or immediately after this. And I know I've plugged the band 1,000 times because I love them, and I'm super excited that I get to go see them in March with David and Sarah from Macabre Emporium. You need to listen to the song Christmas Truce by Sabaton. It's not their normal, fast-paced, it's not their normal type of song. It is, how do I want to put it? It's haunting and sad and kind of helps to put into perspective what these guys were going through. And it's fantastic. So you absolutely have to listen to that song. Matter of fact, if you're on Spotify, I can put a link to the song in it so that when you scroll down past the episode, it'll be there. So you can just click on that afterwards and listen to it. If not, go on YouTube because the video is awesome too. It kind of ties it all together with what I'm doing here. So he has this sick, fancy all this hate, war, and discomfort on a day like this. I thought to myself, the whole spirit of Christmas seemed to be there. So much so that I remember thinking, this indescribable something in the air, this peace and goodwill feeling, surely will have some effect on the situation here today. And I wasn't far wrong. It did around us anyway. And I've always been so glad to think of my luck in, firstly, being actually in the trenches on Christmas Day, and secondly, being on the spot where a quiet, unique little episode took place. Everything looked merry and bright that morning, The discomforts seemed to be less somehow. They seemed to have epitomized themselves in intense, frosty cold. It was just the sort of day for peace to be declared. If only it had only lasted 5 months and not 3 more years. Because, I mean, at this point in time, yeah, a lot of people have died in the trenches. It's a drop in the bucket compared to the final numbers of World War I. It would have made such a good finale. Absolutely agreed. I should like to have suddenly heard an immense siren blowing. Everybody to stop and say, "What was that?" Sirens blowing again. Appearance of a small figure running across the frozen mud waving something. He gets closer. A telegraph boy with a wire. He handed it to me. With trembling fingers, I opened it. Quote, "War off, return home, George R.I." Cheers. But no, it was a nice, fine day. That was all. Walking about the trench a little later, discussing the curious affairs of the night before, we suddenly became aware of the fact that we were seeing a lot of evidence of Germans. Heads were bobbing about and showing over the parapet in a most reckless way, and as we looked, this phenomenon became more pronounced. A complete Bush figure suddenly appeared on the parapet and looked about itself. This complaint became infectious. It didn't take our men long to be up on the skyline. This was the signal for more Bush anatomy to be disclosed, and this was replied to by all of our Alfs and Bills until, in less time than it takes to tell, half a dozen or so of each of the belligerents were outside of their trenches and were advancing towards each other in no man's land. A strange sight, truly. Absolutely. They call it no man's land for a reason. I clambered up and over our parapet and moved out across the field to look. Clad in a muddy suit of khaki and wearing a sheepskin coat and balaclava helmet, I joined the throng about halfway across to the German trenches. It all felt most curious. Here were these sausage-eating wretches who had elected to start this infernal European fracas, and in doing so had brought us all into the same muddy pickle as themselves. This was my first real sight of them at close quarters. Here they were, the actual practical soldiers of the German army. There was not an atom of hate on either side that day. And yet, on our side, not for a moment was the will to war and the will to beat them relaxed. It was just like the interval between rounds in a friendly boxing match. The difference in type between our men and theirs was very marked. There was no contrasting the spirits of the two parties. Our men in their scratch costumes of dirty, muddy khaki, with their various assorted headdresses of woolen helmets, mufflers, and battered hats, were a light-hearted, open, humorous collection, as opposed to the somber demeanor and stolid appearance of the Huns in their gray-green faded uniforms, top boots, and pork pie hats. The shortest effect I can give our impression I had was that our men, superior, broad-minded, more frank, and lovable beings, were regarding these faded, unimaginative products of perverted culture as a set of objectionable but amusing lunatics whose heads had got to be eventually smacked in. So basically, it's like, yeah, like we're out here in all this ragtag stuff, but we know how to fight, and these guys have all matching uniforms and they look great, but we still have to kick their asses eventually, or wait for Marines to show up and kick their asses too, because that's going to be a lot of fun. Look at that one over there, Bill, our Bert would say, as he pointed at some particularly curious member of the party. I strolled about amongst all of them and sucked in as many impressions as I could. 2 or 3 of the Bushes seemed to be particularly interested in me, and after they walked around me once or twice with sullen curiosity stamped on their faces, one came out and said, "Officer?" I nodded my head, which means yes in most languages, and besides, I can't talk German. Same, dude. These devils, I could see, all wanted to be friendly, but none of them possessed the open, frank geniality of our men. However, everyone was talking and laughing and souvenir hunting. I spotted a German officer, some sort of lieutenant, I should think, and being a bit of a collector, I intimated to him that I had taken a fancy to some of his buttons. What a hobby, collecting buttons. That's so exciting. I'd put that up there with being a philatelist, which, if you don't know what that is, that's a stamp collector. And why do I know what that word means? Venture Brothers. Thank you. Go Team Venture. We both then said things to each other, which neither understood, and agreed to do a swap. I brought out my wire clippers and with a few deft snips, removed a couple of his buttons and put them in my pocket. I then gave him 2 of mine in exchange. Whilst this was going on, babbling of guttural ejaculations Man, this dude, I know that he wasn't being a pig, but my dumb brain, my like 15-year-old brain just goes guttural ejaculations. Babbling of guttural ejaculations emanated from one of the logger shifters. It told me that some idea had occurred to someone. Suddenly, one of the Bushes ran back to his trench and presently reappeared with a large camera. I posed in a mixed group for several photographs and have ever since wished I fixed up some arrangement for getting a copy. No doubt, framed editions of this photograph are reposing on some Hun's mantelpiece, showing clearly and unmistakably to admiring strafers how a group of perfidious English surrendered unconditionally on Christmas Day to the brave Deutschers. Slowly, the meeting began to disperse, a sort of feeling that the authorities on both sides were not very enthusiastic about the fraternization seemed to creep across the gathering. We parted, but there was a distinct and friendly understanding that Christmas Day would be left to finish in tranquility. The last I saw of this little affair was a vision of one of my machine gunners, who was a bit of an amateur hairdresser in civil life, cutting the unnaturally long hair of a docile Bouche, who was patiently kneeled on the ground whilst the automatic clippers crept across the back of his neck. So then there's also the stories about like the famous football game that took place. That unfortunately didn't happen at this trench. I couldn't find any firsthand accounts of that. I tried so hard and I just couldn't find any. But there's so many stories from both sides saying, hey, we took the day off, stopping fighting and just playing a game of football, soccer. I don't like calling it football. I'm an American and our football's better than yours, even though it's starting to get to the point where they are just as dramatic with the physical contact in American football as they are with English football, where a quarterback could get looked at just right, and the referees are just throwing flags at everybody because we can't touch the quarterback even though he's a football player. Anyway, to be able to stop and do something like this out between the trenches, these guys remembered that they're basically still kids. They also learned that they had far more in common with each other than they would with any of the higher-ups from their own countries. There's no agreed upon day that the truce actually ended because it was happening basically all across the line. Once the first one happened and word spread to the next trench of like, hey, we went out and met with these guys. We traded food. They're pretty cool. Everybody started doing it because it was just that one spark for both sides. And it just spread like wildfire in the best way possible. Most people seem to think that the truce would have ended like December 26th or 27th, with the shelling and shooting starting again under orders from men that were miles away in the back, somewhere safe from the horrors of the front line. I pretty often, when I do these stories for basically any episode that I'm doing, I find myself trying to put myself in that situation. You've been rained on, you're freezing, you're thousands of miles from home on Christmas, and then somebody starts singing Christmas songs on the other side because they are probably going through the same thing you are, and somebody hears it on your side, and then you guys start singing. Then everybody's having a good time. You don't know each other, but you get to know each other a little bit. You spend a couple of days getting to know your enemy on a human level, and then a couple of days later, you get orders from the rear saying, hey, we don't know what you guys are doing screwing around up there. Get back to fighting. Then you have to put yourself back into the mentality to forget that these guys are human. And you got to start shooting at each other again. Even though you didn't know each other all that well in the first place. In a way, you may have considered this other person a friend for a little bit. Then the whistle gets blown and you go over the top of your trench and you move forward. And you land in an enemy trench and you're possibly forced to fight the man that you shared cigarettes, chocolate, and stories with hand to hand. Absolutely horrific. And it goes to show, like I've said before, I didn't start this show to glorify war or violence like that. I wanted to bring like a little bit more of a human element to it because, yeah, you can go watch documentaries on YouTube where some dude in glasses with a very fancy title is just like, and this is what happened on this day, and this is how many men were killed. You very rarely get to hear their stories. And I want to find as many of those as I can so that these people aren't forgotten. Yeah, they're gone. They've been gone for decades, 100 years at some points, in some cases with these guys. But trying to find that, to bring it back to life, even for a little bit, just so that these people aren't completely forgotten forever, because they died in a war that made absolutely no sense and made absolutely no difference. I want to try to do that. Another one I would highly recommend. I can't remember the exact name of the series. But Dan Carlin on Hardcore History, who, I'll tell you right now, I want to be Dan Carlin when I grow up, because the guy is awesome. He did a series about World War I, and I believe it was 6 or 7 episodes, and they're all 4 to 5 hours long. And when he released them, it was probably 2018, 2017, somewhere in there. I listened to them at work. I was doing machining at the time. I was working at a plastics factory where we made plastic reels. And he has some stories in there where he's telling them, and obviously talking about the numbers and all that. And then he would randomly throw in a letter that he found from somebody that fought there. And I'm not ashamed to tell you, I stood at my machine while I was listening to this man read stories from a 17-year-old kid that thought war was going to be romantic and it was going to be fun and a great way to see the world. Listening to this kid write a letter back to his mom about how scared he was. And I just stood there and cried. I'm not ashamed to admit that. But I wanted to tell this story because this is one of the very few times during World War I that something good actually happened. That these guys got just a day to be people again. Instead of, how do they word it? Food for the gun. But it's definitely not as cheerful and, upbeat as a lot of my stuff usually is. But it's just a story that needed to be told. So I hope everybody enjoyed it. I'm not going to plug anything because this is a bonus episode. You're going to get music. You might not even get little clips in here, like for the video. It might just be me sitting here talking to you. I think that's what we're going to do. So I'm just going to do my intro music. I'm going to do my outro music. And in between, I'm going to tell a sad story. But until we meet again, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, whatever you do. I'm a Merry Christmas guy myself. Whatever you celebrate, have a good one. We're all going to die someday. So go out and do some goon shit and leave a mark on the world. Just like these guys. Love you. Bye.